you know when I first started loving you? That night at the dinner table when you sat on that ridiculous pine cone.
What? I knew the first time you blew that silly whistle.
Oh, my love.
For here you are, standing there, loving me. Whether or not you should.
So somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good. Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. So somewhere in my youth,
Oh, childhood.
I must have done something.
Quite frankly, I'm appalled. What kind of nonsense is this? You have to have done something good to be worthy of love. Maria von Trapp should know rather better. She is a novice nun. The grace of God is free. Anyway, that's soteriology. What she does say, nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could, is of course completely sound if you're talking about the cosmological argument. So, cosmological arguments, as you remember, are those arguments that start from an observation of the world and something in it. They take several different forms and we'll go through a few of them. But essentially, they all appeal to the impossibility of infinite regression, that things can't keep going backwards, otherwise there wouldn't be anything in existence. There has to be some sort of start. Essentially, it asks the question, how did we get here? Assuming that we are here. Now, that of course is something that you might want to challenge, but that's pretty much another question. So, let's go through Aquinas' 3 ways. He wrote 5 ways. 5 ways. But the first 3 are what we might call cosmological. Cosmological, of course, comes from the Greek word cosmos, meaning an ordered sort of universe, and the phrase is actually coined by Kant, who terms the ontological, the teleological, and the cosmological arguments before trashing them, before then having his own argument for the existence of God, but that's for another day. So, the first way is from motion. Aquinas starts by observing that there are things in motion. These things in motion are either put in motion by someone else, such as this stuffed fox, or they are self-moving, such as me, my hand. A soul is defined as that which is the beginning of self-motion. Or a soul is defined as something that moves itself. This has no soul because it can't move itself. It has to be moved by someone. It is inanimate. Anima, soul. Think of animal, etc. Now you remember that Aquinas absolutely loved Aristotle, and he tries to bring Aristotle up to date being, of course, the 13th century. Now, it's not his fault that Aristotle didn't know about Jesus, so when he says stuff that's contrary to scripture, Aquinas just kind of says, not his fault. If he'd known, obviously he'd have been a Christian. Suspect. Anyway, let's get back to it. So, as you remember, Aquinas' definition of motion is essentially Aristotle's definition of motion. As you remember, Aristotle's definition of motion is from a state of potentiality to actuality. And what is potential can only be made into something actual by something that is actual. So water, for example, this glass of water is potentially hot, it's currently cold. If it were to become hot, it would have to be moved by something that is actually hot. Fire. Fire is, of course, the element that Aquinas is referring to there. If it were to be cooled, if it were boiling, then the boiling water would be potentially cold and would be moved by something that is actually cold. Okay, so air or whatever time I suppose would affect it, but we don't really have to get into the physics of it. This is not a question about physics. The point though is that if there were nothing actual, it couldn't affect anything potential, and then everything would be merely potential. You remember that for Aristotle, matter is eternal and matter is completely potential. So the snow that makes a snowman is the material cause of the snowman, and the material is potential, because potentially that snow could be arranged in a different kind of form or shape. A dog, a cat, a plough, or whatever. So if you had nothing that were actual, there could be no movement from potential to actual. But this is strange because we know that things are in motion, so we have to have some things that are actual, but those things that are actual will have some potentiality to begin with, and this cannot go on infinitely. We have to arrive at something that is only actual, that causes motion but itself is not moving, so has no potential, is pure actuality, and this all men call God, according to Aquinas. The second way is from efficient causes, and if we take the example of this video, it's clear that this has a cause which was not itself. Aquinas says quite clearly that in this world of sense, nothing is the efficient cause of itself. So we have to appeal to something outside of it to be the cause of it, such as I am the cause of this video. And this can't go on forever because I have been caused as well, and therefore without the possibility of an infinite regression, we have to arrive at a first efficient cause. This all men call God. The third way is from contingency. Harriet, it's possible, and we find that there are things in the world that are possible to exist but don't have to exist, and we know they don't have to exist because they didn't always exist. If they always existed, they would be necessary, or rather necessary things must always exist since they couldn't not exist, which would mean that they were never not existing, which means that they always were existing, which would mean that they were eternal. Harriet is my daughter, and because she is possible to exist at a time she didn't exist, about 4 months ago. Well, you existed in Mummy's tummy, didn't you? But you didn't exist in the outside world, and it's so much better that you're here. Yes, it is. But because she exists, it's necessary that her parents, I, exist, or at least had existed at some point, in order to create you. Yes. Also, this is the Basola blanket, isn't it? This is a blanket that Basola knitted just for you, and it's contingent on Basola having knitted it. But this will go on to infinity, because the fact that I exist, I am contingent on my parents having existed, and so forth and so forth. And so if all the things in the universe were merely contingent, merely possible, and owing their necessity to something else, then there wouldn't be any things. But because there are, there must be something that has no contingency, that is entirely necessary, and therefore eternal, and that thing is God. Some objections to the cosmological argument come from Hume, a chum from Scotland, and he says, well, maybe the universe is just there and that's it. Or, in the words of Bertrand Russell, the universe is a brute fact. Maybe that's not very convincing, it's more of a soundbite really. So he then offers some other arguments. He says, well, isn't it just a compositional fallacy to assume that the universe has a cause just because some things in the universe have a cause? This is known as the compositional fallacy because it is saying that what is true of the parts applies to the whole, but this isn't necessarily the case. An example would be where you have one of those photos or pictures that are made up of smaller photos. So you could have a photo or a picture of Darth Vader, but all the little pictures that make up Darth Vader's face are actually of Yoda. So many Yodas doesn't mean that you have a Darth Vader. Now, as you remember, Copleston responds to Bertrand Russell's reiteration of this compositional fallacy. Russell says, just because the human, all humans have a mother, doesn't mean the human race has a mother. And Copleston points out that this is a false analogy and actually a false application of the compositional fallacy. So it's a fallacy, the fallacy of saying something is a fallacy when it isn't actually a fallacy, because he's already defined the world or the universe as the aggregate of its constituent parts. And as he points out, if you add up chocolate bars to infinity, you don't suddenly get a sheep. So if the universe is merely the aggregate of things that are contingent, it doesn't give you something that is itself necessary. He hasn't also attributed the same cause to the universe as to things in the universe. So saying the human race has a mother because human beings have a mother is to attribute the same cause to the whole as to its constituent parts, but that is not what he's doing. He points towards a transcendent cause, as in God. So the fallacy perhaps does not apply there, and it's not perhaps the best criticism. Hume also says, well, why should God be a special case? He actually says, it seems a great partiality not to perceive that the same argument extends equally to the deity, so far as we have any conception of him, and that the mind can at least imagine him to be non-existent, or his attributes to be altered. So in other words, why should God get off scot-free? Why should God be the only being that doesn't have a cause, etc., etc.? To that, you just say, well, aren't we just equivocating? I mean, what we've done is we've said we must arrive at a being that is itself uncaused. And if you're then going to say, oh, well, why should this uncaused being be uncaused? Well, that's the answer to the question. It's the reason that we stopped asking the question. It's a solution to the problem. So you can say, I don't think this solves the problem, but you can't say, well, why wouldn't that also be subject to the same problems? Because it isn't by definition. That's how you've defined it. That's the whole point. He also says, well, maybe the universe itself is the necessary being. But again, as we've already established, the universe is merely the word that we give for all the stuff in the universe, and all the stuff in the universe seems to be, Why shouldn't the universe itself be the necessary thing? Well, that's because we've already established that the universe is merely the name we give to its constituent parts. All its constituent parts are, of course, contingent, so saying that all these contingent things are necessary in them doesn't seem to really make sense. So he perhaps loses out on that one there. Some of the more recent objections to cosmological arguments have come from, of course, physics, or modern physics, or even not quite so modern physics. So one of the alternative views of the universe with the steady state model, which says essentially that the universe has always been, or an appeal to some sort of form of multiverse theory to basically try and suggest that infinite regression is either possible or that an eternal universe is possible and therefore doesn't require any explanation. It's quite a weak objection in the face of modern or current scientific evidence. The Big Bang theory is widely accepted, and background radiation in forms of microwaves and red shift, just Google that stuff, strongly suggests that the Big Bang theory is in fact the correct model for the universe, and that therefore the universe did have a definite start. Time and space seem to be linked, therefore before there is time there is no space, or when there's no space there's no time. So we kind of have to look at something with a definite start, and this kind of cyclical universe thing is still completely theoretical, and most scientists don't give it credence. So you should think about that. On the other hand, Pokinghorn does want to say that the claim that God created the universe is not a statement that at a particular time he did something, but that at all times he keeps the world in being. And so he says that whether the steady state theory had won out over the Big Bang theory or vice versa, he says that theology could have coped with either of those theories being true, because essentially cosmology, the themes of cosmology, are insights, not knockdown proofs. Leibniz's version of cosmological argument is from the principle of sufficient reason. Sufficient reason means that there has to be a total explanation for any one particular fact. So, if we are to explain the fact of the objects in this room, we would have to explain each of them individually, and if we just pick at this bottle of obsession. So why is that bottle of obsession on that shelf there? Well, my mum, bless her, started buying me this obsession scent when I was about 14, and I like it, and so pretty much every birthday, every Christmas I get a bottle. However, I don't use it all that often, so I have about 4 unopened bottles, and they don't sell very easily on eBay, so I'm never going to run out. And so why it's on my shelf is because at some point I think I was running out the door and I thought I'll spray some spray, and then this is closest to the front door, so I chucked it on the shelf and it's there, and without that it wouldn't be there. But obviously you've got to then explain why it is that my mum decided to buy the bottle, where she got it from, etc, etc, and you'd have to essentially explain the whole series of events just to explain why that was on the shelf there, and you do that for all the other things. So you see that the principle of sufficient reason is a principle, according to Leibniz, that one of the two principles that guides our reason, that and the principle of non-contradiction, whereby a thing cannot be and not be the same thing in the same respect at the same time. Aristotle, P can't be P and not P at the same time. And the important thing is that we can't necessarily know the whole story, but it's not about whether we know what the sufficient reason is. It's simply that without this totality of events, any particular thing would not be. And so because there is something, because there is this bottle of obsession in my hand, we mustn't obsess over the efficient causes, but without those efficient causes this wouldn't be in my hand right now. So use a time travel thought experiment. If you time travel back to 20 years ago and I had said, Mum, I absolutely hate this scent, please don't ever buy me a bottle of obsession again, presumably I wouldn't have this one in my hand right now, unless my mum hated me so much as to give me something that she knew that I hated. I should just tell her, shouldn't I? I should just say, I've got 4 bottles, please don't buy me anymore. But, you know, sometimes it's hard to have those conversations with your mum. One bit of Leibniz that you might have forgotten is his monadology. A monad is the word that he gives to a simple substance, and again he begins by observing that in the world there are some things that are complex, and these complex things are built from simpler things. So take a pile of books. The pile of books is made up of smaller things, such as our book. Here is one of the books, William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, and I hope you have been remembering all those things. And obviously this is compiled of sheets of paper, so each page is a simpler part of the book. And then we could break this page down into the words on the page, or the molecules that make up the page, etc., etc. And so because we know or observe that there are complex things, there must be simpler things which make up the complex things. The simplest thing, not an atom, of course, the atom can be broken down into something simpler still, and he doesn't even really know about atoms so much at the time of writing, so this is purely conceptual, and the word that he gives to the concept of the simplest substance is a monad. Now, monads must be brought into existence either simultaneously, and they must be destroyed instantaneously as well. And the reason for this is because, okay, if we're going to assemble a pile of books, we start with this book, and then we have another book, and then we add this to this, and then we add a third book, and a fourth book, and a fifth book. Fine. So this hasn't come about instantaneously. We've got stuff that is simpler, and we've added to it. We've compiled things, taking simple things and adding it together as we would the ingredients of a cake. And if we're going to destroy this, well, we disassemble it bit by bit, and okay, we throw them up in the air or we blow them to small smithereens, but it's still essentially the same point. When you get to the simplest thing, there's nothing that is building it up like the pile of books, and so it has to be instantaneously created and instantaneously destroyed. The question is, what would have the power to instantaneously create or instantaneously destroy these things? God. And God also must be simple. And that, of course, is an important theological point. So there you have, in a nutshell, some of the cosmological arguments for the existence of God, which essentially appeal to some fact of the universe that isn't very controversial. There's some stuff, and it asks, with talking heads, how did we get here?
Living in a shotgun shack, and you may find yourself in another part of the world, and you may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile, and you may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife, and you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again. After the money's gone, once in a lifetime, water flowing underground. And you may...
So, has she convinced you of the existence of God?